I feel like the argument before the Game Changers was you can't build as much muscle, or you can't build muscle on a plant-based diet. And I think even the naysayers have now switched to saying, okay, well, you can do it, but it's harder. Right? And there's sort of some truth to that, right? Like, especially if you've been eating a certain way for 20, 30, 40 years, and then you're trying to switch, that's going to be challenging, right? From a habit perspective. And then, to be fair, if you just eat a bunch of steak and eggs and bacon and milk, it is easier to get the protein in, right? But you don't eat protein, generally you eat food, and food comes as a package, and so you've got to worry about, when people talk about quality of protein, to me it would be more interesting to shift that definition and say, what does that protein come with, right? Does it come with saturated fat and cholesterol and TMAO and advanced glycation end products, which cause cancer, or does it come with fiber and phytonutrients or folate and all these sorts of things? So I think the conversation shifted from, you can't build the muscle, it's impossible, to, okay, you can. And there's more research that's come out since the film, really reinforcing sort of the thesis of the film.
That was James Wilks, an elite combatives instructor and winner of The Ultimate Fighter, best known for producing and narrating The Game Changers, a critically acclaimed documentary about the dramatic rise of plant-based eating in professional sports. The Game Changers was executive produced by James Cameron, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jackie Chan, Lewis Hamilton, and Chris Paul, and the film went on to become the most viewed documentary of all time, garnering unprecedented accreditation from the U.S. Department of Defense, Health, and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Wilks was subsequently rated on Men's Health as number 3 on their list of the 13th most influential men in health and fitness. He's basically a badass. Following the release of The Game Changers, Wilks co-founded the Game Changers Institute, a nonprofit research, educational, and advocacy platform that promotes plant-forward nutrition in order to help improve personal performance, advance public health, and protect the environment. Wilks also recently executive produced Eating Our Way to Extinction, an award-winning documentary narrated by Kate Winslet, which addresses the dramatic impact our food choices have on global ecosystems. We covered his plant-based advocacy journey and what led him to the creation of The Game Changers, his debate with Chris Kresser on the Joe Rogan Experience, and how the world of athletics has been influenced by his film, why the general public is so confused about nutrition science, and the most frustrating thing he's seeing in food recommendations and athletics today. We talked about the rise in popularity of organ meats, collagen intake, carnivore diets, protein myths, and more. I had so much fun sitting down with James for this episode, but even after the camera shut off, our conversation continued, and we ended up talking about the most layered philosophical topics, going back and forth that most people avoid out of fear of uncomfortability, which happens to be my favorite kind of conversation. And I got to see a side of him that reflected why he has been so influential in his work of plant-based advocacy. He's broken a lot of narratives because he pushes the limits of getting to the heart of the topic at hand, and he's a total go-getter. James is a no BS, open-hearted intellectual full of passion and charisma, and you just want to keep talking to him because he's so contemplative, real, and humble. Make sure to watch the documentary The Game Changers if you haven't already, but you've probably already seen it, and enjoy the episode. Let's get into it. Thanks so much for being here, James. I have looked up to you and really admired your work for a long time. My husband and I love your documentary, The Game Changers, so I'm honored to have you on our show.
No, I'm honored to be here. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and I really want to get into athletes and nutrition, protein myths, and the most common misconceptions, what's frustrating you about what you're seeing in nutrition, science, and athletes. But I also want to talk about The Game Changers, your experience on the Joe Rogan show. Mm-hmm. So can you first start out by telling me a little bit about your plant-based story and what led you to creating The Game Changers?
Yeah, I mean, obviously a lot of it's sort of covered in the documentary itself. I was training for a fight. I got injured sparring with a guy called Fabricio Verdum, who had about 60 or 70 pounds more muscle than me. He was actually went on to win the heavyweight championship in the UFC at one point. And we were sparring, tore ligaments in both of my knees, and just, I was 2 weeks out from a fight, couldn't fight, obviously. And then I thought, well, what can I do with my time that's going to be most productive? And so I thought, well, I've got all these hours every day. And so I started looking into nutrition, started looking at the peer-reviewed science on nutrition for optimal recovery and then also athletic performance. And that's when I came across the study about the Roman gladiators. And I thought, well, this can't be true. The strontium calcium analysis, radioisotope analysis, basically unearthed, 5,000 gladiator bones that were analyzed. And it was suggesting that they ate almost exclusively plants. And I thought, well, you need meat for muscle, is what I thought, and you need dairy for bones. How can that be true? And so that wasn't enough to convince me, obviously, but that was enough to start really digging into the research some more. And that's when I sort of contacted the head of nutrition at Harvard, the head of anthropology at Harvard, the president of the American College of Cardiology, the lead delegate of urology for the American Medical Association, and all of these experts. And that's what sort of turned into the Game Changers documentary, basically.
That's awesome. I remember that part about the gladiators in the documentary. That was something presented that I'd never heard before. And like, I've been plant-based for, 15 years. And I'm like, I have never heard something like that.
Yeah. And contemporarily, they were known as hordearii, which means the barley men. So they were known for eating a lot of barley and just a lot of plant foods. So
and did you go plant-based overnight, or was it like a gradual transition for you?
No, I didn't sort of make the decision, okay, I'm going plant-based. I was sort of gradually shifting, cutting out animal products slowly, with cutting out meat first, and then eggs, and then fish and dairy over sort of 6-week period. And then I thought, well, now I'm going to try going completely plant-based and see what happens. And that's when my endurance improved, as you saw in the documentary, doing the battling ropes for an hour. The most I'd ever done before was 8 minutes. And then what I didn't show in the documentary is, my strength went up as well. So bench press on dumbbells, for example. And for some people, this will sound like a lot, and some people it won't. Obviously, depends on, it's all relative. But I went from 105-pound dumbbells in each hand, dumbbell press for 5 reps, to 115 pounds in each hand for 6 reps within just a few weeks. So It really had a big impact on me.
Yeah, and that was a similar transformation for my husband too, because when he had the same kind of misconceptions about meat and protein and athleticism, and so when he went plant-based, he's like just found himself with so much more energy and a desire to work out. He's like, I think I'm gonna go for a run today. And he never was in that position. That's when he read Rich Roll's book, and everything just took off from there, because it was just undeniable.
Yeah, that's one of the things, because some people say, oh, it was because people started working out more, but a friend of ours who helped get the film onto Netflix for us, he actually once he went plant-based, he just felt like he had more energy, right? And then, so then he was able to start working out more, and then he lost 40 pounds of fat, right?
Yeah, so it was just like a natural desire. He's like, I just want to get up and go move my body.
Yeah, he just got more energy.
Yeah, totally. So I was listening to another interview that you did talking about the Game Changers being, what is it, like one of the most popular or viewed documentaries?
Yeah, I mean, on all accounts, it seems to be the most viewed documentary of all time, with over a conservative estimate of over 100 million views. So Netflix doesn't actually give its numbers, and then we're on Youku in China, which is twice as 800 million viewers in China on Youku. And between those two platforms and the other platforms that are on, like iTunes and Google Play and Vimeo and so forth, we've also had some research done with Nielsen, which can sort of assess how many people have been watching it, at least in America. And it seems that at least over 100 million people. We had over 1.5 billion media impressions, including over 40,000 organic press articles written about the film. And then according to Google Trends, interest in plant-based eating more than tripled worldwide within 2 weeks of the film's release. And recently, just in the last few months, we had a consulting analyst from Merrill Lynch look at sort of the trends since 2004. And it showed that 75% of the increased interest in plant-based eating since 2004 was a direct result of the film. So it seems by far it's the single most impactful sort of piece of media or program or whatever to shift people towards more plant-based eating.
And it makes complete sense because, like you were saying somewhere else about how prior to the film, it was like 8 out of 10 plant-based eaters were women. Mm-hmm. And after the film, that shifted dramatically. And since so much of our choices in how we eat and the lifestyles we live is directly related to our social and cultural relations in life, like if your partner is suddenly starting to be interested in something that he wasn't interested in before, it makes sense how it's going to create a much bigger boom and like a more like consistent long-term like sustainable way to eat because you have other people around you that's doing it now, and it's like a ripple effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think before, the messaging around plant-based eating was more around compassion for animals and environment. Both of those things were important, but I think that would appeal more to women generally. And actually, a lot of the behavioral psychology research shows that with the compassionate messaging and caring about animals and the environment, a lot of young men are insecure about their masculinity, and compassion is synonymous with femininity. And so there's actually some research done on this where men in the short term, when they see that kind of messaging, will eat less meat, but they'll actually end up eating more than they originally were later on because they're trying to overcompensate for sort of feeling a bit too compassionate. And so obviously the messaging in the Game Changers was quite different. As you said, 8 out of 10 vegetarians, vegans, plant-based eaters were female before the film. We just had a survey done in the US. I think it was 1 in 14 women, 1 in 10 people overall, and 1 in 7 men had actually seen the film in the United States. And they totally switched. So it was like a 2-to-1 male to female ratio of the respondents that are now eating plant-based. So it's pretty exciting.
Well, that is so cool. That's so rad because, I mean, the notion of like masculinity and eating meat goes back so long. I did an episode with Dominic Thompson. I don't know if you know who he is, but that was a really great one talking about veganism and masculinity. And he had some really fascinating points about how like being this notion of hunting and killing animals and eating lots of meat and how we think that's masculinity when really it's much more masculine to be a protector.
Right.
And so if we could shift that like greater understanding of what does it even mean to have that masculine energy, like being a protector makes much more sense.
Yeah, totally.
Anyway.
I don't typically sort of buy into the gender norms, right? But as traditional men, I think that's why athletes, firefighters, and soldiers in the film appealed, to people. And then, as you're right, I think that comes from sort of provider and protector. And for provider, back in the day, like what else were they providing other than meat, right? Which is funny because men, women, and children, in foraging societies were actually producing much more of the calories, around 80% of the calories. And then the men were doing much more work. And hunting didn't even become remotely efficient until about 30 to 60,000 years ago with the advent of the bow and arrow, right? It was extremely inefficient before then. And even then, they weren't really catching much of the calories. And so I think they felt like they needed to celebrate, and there was sort of celebrations around, hey, we've caught this meat. But really, they weren't providing the majority of the calories. The men, women, and children were. Yeah,
that's so interesting. And it makes so much sense that when men are watching this documentary, and women too, but, generally more appealing to men, like you were saying, that they're like, oh yeah, it's all great and good that, eating plant-based is good for the environment, kinder to animals. But like, how is my strength going to be? How's my athleticism going to be here? Yeah. And so that film just totally spoke to people. And
because even the health message actually is sort of it sort of affects different people in different ways. So once people are older, they start caring more about their diabetes or heart disease risk, or their friends are dying from something, and then they start caring. But actually for young people, especially young men, there's this sort of an additional backfire effect based on something called the handicap principle in evolutionary biology, which manifests both physically, for example, with peacocks. They say that the large feathers are basically the male trying to say, hey, I've got all these beautiful feathers which are hard to carry around, but I'm such a masculine peacock that I haven't been eaten by predators. But it also, the handicap principle manifests behaviorally also. So you tell a young man to stop smoking because it's bad for him, or to stop eating meat because it's bad for him. He actually will tend to do more of it, again, a backfire, because he's trying to demonstrate that things that affect other people won't affect him because he's got better genes and he's more alpha male.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so depending on who you're trying to reach, right, you're going to want to give a different message. Older people are going to care more about their health than younger people. And so, when it comes to performance, either athletic performance or sexual performance or performance at work, that's going to resonate more with younger people, and especially with men in general, again, generalizing there.
Yeah, and another random example is, I've spoken to some men before who have had vasectomies, and they're like, it would be so cool if, I was the one that could still get my partner pregnant, even with the vasectomy. It didn't work on me type of thing. That's another prime example for sure.
No, totally.
So with this huge amount of people watching it, reviewing it, critiquing it, also is going to come with a lot of criticism. And, how did that feel to even have people attempting to just debunk your film in an hour, in half an hour or an hour that you put your whole life work into? The reason why I asked that is because I watched your entire debate with Chris Kresser on the Joe Rogan Experience, because I love debates. I love listening to debates. They're my favorite thing ever, and you just totally crushed it. And I was telling everyone I know, you got to watch this watch this debate. with James Wilks. So like, how did that feel? I mean, you expressed that in the conversation of like, look, you tried to like debunk my film in the last episode. Maybe you can explain for people who don't know about this conversation what happened with that.
Yeah, I mean, like just going back, there was quite a lot of people that were just putting out articles trying to they were actually sort of saying that we were cherry picking, even though we were using the preponderance of evidence. We were, interviewing. Like one of the criticisms of some of the plant-based films is that they don't include like high-level experts in all the different fields. But I mentioned some of the experts that we had earlier, and then just looking at the preponderance evidence in the large, the WHO, the FAO, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, all recommending plant-predominant or plant-exclusive diets. But we did get some pushback, but there was never any great arguments against the film that I couldn't argue against. And it was frustrating. Chris said, I spent 7 hours doing this. And I was thinking, I spent 7 years making this film, right? And unfortunately, we couldn't put we had 600 hours of footage. We couldn't put it all into the film. Tons of great experts that didn't even make it into the film, unfortunately. The Joe Rogan episode, it was funny. I'd had people on social media, on Instagram say, hey, I saw your film. I got plant-based. And then, a few months later, they're like, I just watched the Chris Kresser episode and you were lying and I've switched back to eating meat. And then after the Joe Rogan episode, that same person, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have taken. But, when I sat there and watched the Chris Kresser episode, which we tried to get on, by the way, to debate him like live the first time when Chris Kresser went on and did a 3-hour
And to be clear for anyone watching or listening to this, that Joe Rogan had on Chris Kresser to basically debunk the Game Changers film without you there, James Wilks.
I tried to get on.
That was the first
I didn't want to get myself on. Again, I don't really think that I'm an expert, so I tried to put on our chief science advisor, David Goldman, who has a double master's degree in exercise physiology and nutrition, right? Counsels a lot of Olympic gold medalists and football players and just really been in the space for a long time. Real genius in terms of nutrition and athletic performance. And so I tried to put him forward for that first episode with Chris Kresser. Again, Chris Kresser is advocating for sort of more of a paleo-ish type of diet. And he always says that he has master's training in nutrition. What he means is that there was one nutrition class, I think, in his master's degree in, what is it? He's a, what was his qualification in? Do you remember?
I don't remember, but I heard you saying
acupuncture.
Yeah, that's what it was.
And he never mentions that on Joe Rogan. So not that I'm saying anything positive or negative about acupuncture, but it's not his field of expertise. Just like I don't feel like it's mine. Mm-hmm. But when I made the film, I'd read over 1,000 hours of peer-reviewed research. I've now read a little over 3,000, and people call BS on that. But it's just I'm a little bit OCD, and so I just read and read and read.
Yeah,
and read.
yeah.
I really enjoy the information. But yeah, he spent 7 hours, and I sat there thinking, if I didn't know what I know, I would have been actually quite convinced by Chris's arguments. And so that week leading up to the Joe Rogan episode, where Joe kindly gave me the chance to debate Chris Kresser.
After that first episode.
Yeah, after the first episode. So I went back on, and the second time Chris was on, it was a debate with myself. And again, I tried to put David Goldman or someone else forward to debate that has degrees in nutrition and exercise, but they wanted me on. I said, okay, fair enough.
Yeah, because that's not as clicky. Like they're like, who's David Goldman?
Yeah,
what?
they wouldn't know. Yeah,
Oh, but they
so
know
to
James
have
Wilks.
me, the face of the film.
Yeah.
And so, to be honest, I don't think I did a great job in the first 45 minutes. I picked a topic that wasn't great. Joe was really on his side.
Yeah.
It was sort of 2-on-1. And I didn't pick the best topic to argue. Chris Kresser had misquoted an article. Mm-hmm. He made his own quote, right, by adding up some figures. And then he put quotes on it and then put the name of the article underneath. Anytime you see quotations like that, it really should be referencing the article itself.
The article.
But it was his own quote, but he made out it was a quote from the article. And so I picked that, and it was a little bit nitpicky.
No, but it's still valid, though.
It's valid, but it wasn't the best argument. Mm-hmm. It was something like where, 60-something% of studies showed no effect, 12% showed a positive, 12%, and then he'd added the 60 and the 72 saying, something like this, saying, oh, they showed a negative effect, right? It just counted our point, but it was just his own quote, and he sort of made up this statistic. I went in a little bit too amped up, and I was sort of like, I felt like I was going in for a fight, honestly. It
kind of is. You're like defending your life's work.
Yeah, exactly. But I think I was a little bit amped up, and probably. But anyway, after about the 45-minute mark, where unfortunately I think a lot of people who are really into meat eating and anti-plant-based diets already stopped watching by then. But if people watch the whole thing, I think you'll see that I fairly won. I mean, even Joe Rogan, right, who's relatively, usually pretty anti-plant-based diets, said that I didn't lose a single argument. So
yeah, I mean, I definitely saw that. I saw on his page, he's like vegan. He did a post when the episode came out. Vegans, you're gonna love this one.
Yeah.
Like, I think James, something about James, like, proving me wrong, or at least, like,
Yeah.
And I'm like, what? So I went and watched the entire thing in clips. In clips, I watched it.
Yeah, other people like that are really anti-vegan were saying, "Oh, Joe must be trolling people. There's no way."
Yeah. At first, it felt like that.
Yeah.
At first, I was thinking, why did he say that?
Yeah, but by the end, I think it was clear on protein quality, on protein quantity, on B12, on a whole range of things. And I was much prepared for. I only covered about 15-20% of what we wanted to cover, and I had a lot more arguments, from environmental stuff to crop deaths to. There's all sorts of stuff that I was, and a lot of stuff across health and athletic performance that I was planning to cover, but we didn't get to it. And
after the conversation, was there any kind of consensus between you and Chris in any form?
No, he still stands by.
Yeah.
He stands by his arguments. He tries to put down my arguments. I could have done a better job. Like, he started listing off some things showing that meat didn't have an impact on, like, arterial disease. And at the time in the episode, I didn't realize that those studies were on rats, that he was just suddenly bringing up out of the blue. Because it's kind of challenging when you haven't had a chance to see. I think a real debate, both sides should share their sources, beforehand, right? And then maybe have another pass of, okay, you want to address that, and then come up with more sources and share those, and then have the debate.
Yeah.
But Chris would throw out a whole bunch of stuff, related on, some things that affect mice don't affect rats and vice versa. So think of the difference between, like, rats and mice and humans, right? There's a big difference.
It's definitely weak evidence.
Yeah.
Compared to what it can be, for sure.
Yeah.
So how receptive are people nowadays after the film, do you feel like, to plant-based diets, athletes?
I think it's still a mix. I think there's still a mix, but I think there's a general shift. I feel like the argument before the game changers was you can't build as much muscle, or you can't build muscle on a plant-based diet. And I think even the naysayers have now switched to saying, okay, well, you can do it, but it's harder, right? And there's sort of some truth to that, right? Like, especially if you've been eating a certain way for 20, 30, 40 years, and then you're trying to switch, that's going to be challenging, right? From a habit perspective. And then, to be fair, if you just eat a bunch of steak and eggs and bacon and, milk, it is easier to get the protein in, right? But you don't eat protein, generally you eat food, and food comes as a package. And so you've got to worry about, when people talk about quality of protein, to me it would be more interesting to shift that definition and say, what does that protein come with, right? Does it come with saturated fat and cholesterol and TMAO and advanced glycation end products, which cause cancer, or does it come with fiber and phytonutrients or folate and, all these sorts of things. So I think the conversation shifted from you can't build the muscle, it's impossible, to, okay, you can. And there's more research that's come out since the film, really reinforcing sort of the thesis of the film. So, for example, in 2021, in the journal Sports Medicine, there was a 12-week interventional study where they put people on plant-based diets and supplemented with a bit of soy protein to bring it up to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And then they did an animal-based, or sort of an omnivorous diet, where they supplemented with whey protein to bring it up to 1.6. So 1.6 grams per kilogram, which seems to be the sweet spot for the vast majority of people to build, to maximize muscle mass. There was no differences after the 12-week period, and that was an interventional study. It wasn't just observational. And then in terms of health, just recently this year in 2022, Harvard researchers published findings from the Million Veterans study that showed that those eating the most plant-based foods had a 25% less likely to die during the whole study period. All right, it went on for years. And those who ate the most whole plant foods, right, so not just plant foods, but whole plant foods, had a 36% decreased likelihood of dying during the study period. So again, it's not just the research that came before the film. There's just more research coming out, both from an athletic performance and muscle building standpoint and from a health standpoint, just reinforcing the thesis from the film.
Yeah, and that's why, like you said earlier, if anybody had watched the Chris Kresser first episode with Joe Rogan and didn't know anything else like that you knew from all the studying that you done, it would be easy to be like, oh, okay, yeah, he's right. He's onto something. This film is crap or whatever. But that's why listening to both sides is so integral to understanding really what is the truth here. And I think that's so true when it comes to debates, like being able to present your resources so you can... Yeah,
it actually worked out better in the end that we didn't debate him in the first one because he presented information which was just like totally disprovable. So for example, like, cattle are never fed any B12. They get it. Well, I can just show you a whole bunch of like, here's products that are for sale. Here's the top like research companies saying, you know, a lot of cattle are low in B12. So there was just so many things that you could just easily disprove just with a few minutes, you know, looking at the research.
Yeah, a lot of people, if they had just listened to that first one, wouldn't know any, or maybe just even in the future, don't take the time to listen to this other viewpoint, or this other side, all this new research even that's coming out still today, they wouldn't know any of that stuff. And it's easy to have tunnel vision.
Yeah, and with Chris, it was crazy. Like, so, you know, we said that up to 39% of people are low in B12, and most of those are meat eaters, right? And he said, that study, you know, you never gave a citation. So I screen capped the film, the citation was there on the bottom, and it turns out it was the very first citation in his own book on B12. So he'd used the same study and then said that study, that we never cited it and it doesn't exist. And, you know, then he uses all these, he just cherry picked the data basically. You know.
Wow. Do you feel like the general response, like you knowing how you felt after, do you feel the general response was that people understood where you were coming from by the end of it, if they watched the whole thing?
Yeah, I think so. In fact, if you look at Google Trends, you can see a spike in interest after the film in plant-based eating, and then you see another dramatic spike right after the Joe Rogan episode. And obviously, he's got a massive reach. So.
He has so much influence. Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. I'm so glad
and he's great in some ways, but I think he's a bit, you know, Joe is pretty open-minded in most ways, but I honestly feel like when it comes to nutrition, I feel like it's a lot of it is based on his identity. And so like hunting and going back to this masculine sort of energy and feeling the need to be a provider and so forth.
Right, but I guess we're all biased in some way. I feel like he does a pretty good job bringing on all sides on all kinds of topics. Like it's pretty hard, I feel like, to do it like super balanced all the time.
No,
right?
he does, but someone has reviewed how many of people did not believe, how many of the nutrition experts that Joe has had on that don't believe that saturated fat is indicated in atherosclerosis and heart disease, which it very clearly is by like a whole number of measures. Not just people are always saying that you know, plant-based eaters are pointing towards observational studies which don't prove causation. But when it comes to saturated fat and have elevated cholesterol and elevated LDL, that's been done in metabolic wards, right? Which is the best intervention that you can do, where everything is measured, everything that goes in, everything that goes out. And it's been shown like thousands of times that that's the case. So.
Yeah, it's really, really clear. But at the same time, I can't really blame him if that's his bias, because I have on more plant-based people than I do other
for sure.
side.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, it's true.
But it would be super cool to see like more. I would love to see more debates like on his show for sure. Okay, so let's move on. The next thing I want to ask you is, why is the general public, I mean, you're not going to know the answer, but the general public is so confused about nutritional science and diet and arguments about there's so many arguments. So what is your take on and perspective on why that is?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, nutrition is hard to study, right? Because you're basically going to take sort of studies that look at things in a petri dish or in a lab, and then you're going to look at observational studies, epidemiological data, which can sort of give hypotheses and sort of make suggestions around what the truth is. But again, it doesn't show causation necessarily. And then you can look at interventional studies. But the thing is, we can't do long-term interventional studies, right? You can't put people on for 40 years, right, and 50 years and say, you've got to eat this and track them, and like, it's impossible. So first of all, it is difficult to really test, what for sure is causational, right? So that's tricky. Number two, unfortunately, there's a lot of influence from industry in the studies, right? So there's a lot of funding that goes on. And then number three, the media doesn't really present the studies as accurately as they should be. So I remember seeing one study saying, vegans didn't do so well. So I looked at it, and the vegans were eating fish. So, right? So like the media if you just read the headline in the media.
Yeah, which is what most people do.
Yeah. So that, And again, I understand that because most people aren't going to spend 1,000 hours reading peer-reviewed science. I just don't have the time or the background education in order to do so. So it is challenging, and I don't know really what the answer is. What we do know now, though, is that the largest organizations, like I was mentioning earlier, the FAO, the WHO, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, are all saying that we should be eating predominantly or exclusive plant-based diets. And then, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics says that a vegan diet, completely vegan diet, is safe for all stages of the life cycle, right? From pregnancy to infancy to adolescence, including for athletes, and older people. And so, I think it's very clear. Like now, to eat a predominantly plant-based diet, right, the vast amount of your calories coming from plants, like there's just no question, and the evidence is very robust, right? Now, to say, well, is there a benefit to going 100% versus 95%? I still think that there's evidence, right? Strong enough evidence for me to eat 100%. But that strength of 95 to 100% isn't the same as like going from 50% to 95%, right?
Yep.
And so our approach at the Game Changers Institute, which is our nonprofit, it's a research, education, and advocacy platform, is to say it's all or something, not all or nothing, right? And so a lot of people just aren't going to go all in anyway, and it can be quite daunting to think I'm committing to switching completely. And so the science really does show, both for the health and for the environment, is like any shift towards eating more plant-based, especially more whole plant foods, is going to be beneficial, right? And so I think if you say it's very black and white, it's vegan or it's not, and I'm going to judge you if it's not, that's pretty challenging. And so, the evidence is pretty clear. I know it can be confusing, but eating predominantly plant-based or preferably exclusively plant-based is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, and it does seem like, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's way more common now for professional athletes to be seeing massive benefits from going plant-based through their recovery and their performance. It seems a lot more common now.
Yeah, it seems more common. I think it is more common, and we're getting approached at the Institute with a lot of Olympic medalists and NFL, NBA, and players asking for help. One of the things that was interesting when we made the film is that we noticed that team players were a lot less likely to mention it, even if they were plant-based, because sort of a peer pressure, whereas individual athletes would be more outstanding. I mean, in team sports, we would find that they were hiding like the Amy's burritos or something at the bottom of the freezer, right? Because there was a bit of a stigma. And I think that since the Game Changers, that stigma has changed, and people are recognizing that you can have at least as good, if not improved, athletic performance switching to plant-based. Yeah.
And that just goes back to the impacts of social and cultural experiences and how much that's going to affect people's decisions, or maybe how loudly they're going to, or just be comfortable in the fact that they're doing that.
Yeah.
So what is the most frustrating thing that you're seeing in the world of athletes and food recommendations that you're seeing today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it went from one thing, which was like the paleo diet, right? And what's interesting about the paleo diet is actually what happens, people do get improvements going on the paleo diet, switching from the standard American diet. There's weight loss, cholesterol and LDL can come down. What's super interesting, at the time we made the film, the longest study ever done on sort of where they followed up was for 2 years on the paleo diet. And what was interesting is they were actually eating a much more plant-based diet than they were before. So they're cutting out dairy, they're cutting out refined, grains
processed
and sugar,
foods,
heavily processed foods. Refined foods, and then they're increasing the amount of fruits and vegetables. And the one thing actually that they didn't stick with on the recommendations was increased meat consumption. So they did, early on there was a spike in more meat, and then it just dripped down naturally. People just didn't stick to the recommendations that they were given. So really they were, again, cutting out refined, cutting out dairy, eating more fruits and vegetables and whole plant foods. So no wonder they got a benefit. But it sort of shifted from that paleo into even more meat-heavy diet, right? On the extreme end, you got the carnivore type of diet where they're eating only meat, and then especially with the organs, right? Livers and kidneys and brains, people are sometimes just eating that. Now, that can have some benefits in the short term because it's like any exclusion diet, right? Where you're, for example, if you just cut out dairy out of your diet, you can see improvements, in gastrointestinal health and, so of course, by just eating one thing, you're cutting out some of the things that could be bothering you, right? But in the long term, it does not look good, right? If you're just eating a whole bunch of meat. And then, with the heavy metals in the organs and so forth, you're just missing out on, fiber, for example, which is really important to gut health.
So what could be the problems then of eating so many organ meats, or even just such a meat-heavy diet? Like, what have you seen based on the research you've done about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, so there's not any really long-term studies on the carnivore-only diet. Mm-hmm. There has been some people that have followed. Some of the things are is sugar in the urine, because the saturated fat helps clog up the insulin receptors, right? And then you just can't handle any. You can't handle the sugars at all, and so. Increased risk for diabetes, right? And then the urine is much more acidic, and lower acid diets have been shown to have benefits for both health, right? More alkaline diets for health and also for athletic performance. And I think there should be more long-term, should there be, I don't think it would be like ethical to put people on an interventional, right? If you just want to follow someone that's doing it, you could look at more of that research, which just doesn't really exist yet. But you're just missing out on, missing out on fiber and all the phytonutrients and everything else that come with it. And again, the saturated fat, the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee in the United States says to keep saturated fat, 10% or below to keep your heart disease risk down. That's typically going to be much higher on a carnivorous diet.
Right.
And then you're seeing people sort of switching from. Even when I was fighting, people said they were on the paleo diet and then they were drinking a ton of Gatorade. I'm like, well, how is that paleo? They're like, well, I get tired otherwise. I don't really have the energy. It's like, exactly, because you're missing out on all the carbs, right? You're having to do it with sugar like before and after now, because you're not getting it from, a wider variety of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes and so forth. So you're starting to see some people shift now from carnivore into, adding some fruit or honey and that type of thing. So that I think they're recognizing, okay, we need to get some carbs and some plant foods.
Fresh carbs.
Yeah. And this whole sort of, another thing that bothers me, not just from a health perspective, but is from an environmental perspective, this sort of claim that holistic grazing as part of regenerative agriculture is beneficial for the environment, which it's just clearly not, right? So white oak pastures is one of the ones that is sort of pointed to as an example, being a sort of natural, sustainable farm producing grass-fed beef. First of all, they've even said that it's not replicable at large scale, right? Mm-hmm. You just wouldn't have enough. People would have to eat a lot less meat if they were going to eat this way.
Like a lot less.
Yeah, a lot less.
But they're advocating for way more meat. That's what's so interesting.
Yeah, just it doesn't make sense. There's not enough land on the planet, right, number one. Number two, it's funny that they say it's a sustainable farm. In 2017, they sued the federal government because the American bald eagles killed 130,000 of their chickens. Because, I used to think that chickens roaming around on the grass in the open plain was natural. But chicken are jungle fowl, right? And so they should have coverage, coverage to protect them from predators. Mm-hmm. But they're all roaming around. Of course, the farmers can't kill the American bald eagle because it's protected.
Yeah.
And so they sued for $2.2 million in 2017. It's not really a sustainable way of farming. It couldn't happen at large scale. And then this sort of argument about sequestering methane by moving the cattle around has some short-term benefits. It doesn't offset actually the detrimental environmental impact that the cows are causing, but it does mitigate it somewhat. But it's also temporary as well. So again, not my sort of strength of expertise to cover. And there's great folks like Nicholas Carter.
I really want to get him on.
Yeah, no,
on
he'd be
podcast,
great. Yeah, I'm seeing him this weekend, and so he would be great to cover something like that.
You should mention me and be like, do you want to come on Ellen's
podcast?
For
sure.
Yeah, because I would love to get on. Actually, I would love to do like a debate episode on animal ag and the environment versus like plant advocate for the environment.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That would be such a good one because you really see both passionate people on both sides that are like so passionate about it. But to me, on just like a very simple mathematical sense, it does not make sense to increase our animal foods and to do grass-fed, free range, all this stuff, like just not taking into account the amount of land. It's just not possible to sustain the world.
Yeah, and the thing is, those studies where it's shown sort of a benefit for the environment have not been peer-reviewed. When there is, right, it's just like, it's funny because Epic Bars, which is owned by General Mills helped fund the study, and then they're also the number one purchaser of the beef that comes from white oak pastures. So you also got to look at
Yeah.
the motivations behind why they're putting that stuff out.
Yeah, for sure. And even just taking something, going back to the organ meats, like the amount of organ meats that are being advocated now in these circles, take something very specific like liver, like is considered now like a superfood in some of these like high animal food based circles. And if everybody ate the amount of liver that they're advocating for, you know how many whole cows would have to die for the liver? Like literally
Right.
for the liver. We'd have to, it just does not make sense.
Yeah.
Yep, for the amount. Okay,
Yeah.
so that is really great. I love that. I'm trying to think what the next one is, like in regards to the age-old question, like where do you get your protein?
Yeah.
That's something, but now it's kind of switched to, well, it's not as bioavailable from plants.
Yeah. So just going back again, like I said before, I think, it is more challenging, right? Because like plant foods, if you look at plant foods overall, they are lower in protein than like steak or eggs and so forth, right? And so you do have to be more cognizant, I think. So that's the first thing, is be more cognizant. Make sure you're getting like legumes, nuts and seeds, right? And then if you want protein powders, right, you don't have to do them, but it makes it an easier way to get them in for athletes that are really trying to maximize muscle mass.
Yeah.
And so, the bioavailability is the sort of second question. Okay, you can get enough protein, but it's not as available. First of all, there's the PDCAS, which is the protein digestibility amino acid score, which is the score that's most widely used now for protein quality and digestibility. And then there's one that came out in the last 10 years or so, which hasn't been as adopted, but does a little bit better job, called the DS, which is the digestible indispensable amino acid score. It's funny because the dairy industry helped fund that, and surprise, the maximum level used to be 1, and so dairy and soy and meat were all at 1. And now the DS score allows dairy to go above 1, right? And there's a bunch of issues with the protein scoring system. So number one, well, first of all, they were put in place by the FAO and the WHO, and they looked at, for children, particularly 2-year-olds and under, in developing countries and what their protein requirements are. That's sort of how it started, right? And so people somehow in the developed world have taken this program that's went for people are getting very little protein, very little diversity of foods in developing countries, and they've somehow translated it to like what we need here, right, in a developed world where you can go to the grocery store and get like a whole wide variety of whatever you want and get enough calories, right? So it was to solve kwashiorkor, which is protein deficiency, right? And there's just not a single case that I'm aware of in the United States of anyone with kwashiorkor if you're eating enough calories, right? So if you're eating enough calories, you're getting enough protein. And then in terms of the quality, the scoring system isn't for developed world. It's not for people. It's not to do with muscle building, right? People have just sort of taken it because this is the best thing you can do. The second thing is that it's analyzed in rats and pigs primarily, right? They grow at much faster rates. They do it in adolescent pigs, right? And they've got totally different amino acid requirements. The one benefit of the DS protein scoring system is that it looks at oroileal digestibility. So PDCAS looked at like the full digestive tract, right? And the DS program looked at like for the protein from the mouth to the ileum, because past the ileum, and so they put, pretty gross, they basically dig a hole in the pig at the ileum and put a port in so they can see what came out. Because with the old protein scoring system, you would look at the full length of digestive tract, but some of that protein was getting ingested by bacteria and not by people, right? Not by the human gut. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So the protein scoring system was off. Another problem with it is that they feed raw powdered foods to the pigs. Well, I mean, most people cook their beans, right? Because if you don't, they're not good for you, right?
Yep.
And so if you feed raw legumes and raw grains to pigs and assess that, there's very different. There's something called trypsin inhibitors, which inhibits the protein absorption, right? And so if you cook food, that changes things dramatically. And so the studies actually in humans that they've looked at, and you can look at the ileum in humans, you have to put a nasal tube down into the ileum. Digestibility is actually higher in plant foods than some animal foods. So lupin, for example, which is a legume, has around 90% or so digestibility, and it's higher than egg, which is yielded as like one of the key protein foods out there. And so the percent difference is not like 50 to 90% like people used to think. It's really a couple of percent difference. And what really matters is people are always looking at these tiny differences, But what matters is what the actual outcomes are. And the outcome is, if you're eating 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein, as a general recommendation for most people, you build as much muscle. Now, some people need less, some people need more. If you're in a caloric deficit, right, you're trying to lose body fat but still gain or maintain or gain muscle, you need a little bit more protein, perhaps up to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. But if you look at the outcomes that you're actually interested in, right, there's really no difference in muscle gain between the two. And I would argue that there's better athletic performance advantages to having more carbs, lower inflammation, better endothelial function, right, more blood flow, those things that affect athletic performance in the short run, that also affect health in the long run.
Yeah, that's why I love the book Whole, Rethinking the Science of Nutrition with nutritional biochemist T. Colin Campbell. Like that is one of my favorite books because he really breaks down and explains the difference between reductionist science versus holistic science and the importance of that. And so often you can just see a headline like, with a story, like you said, and it's like it could be very reductionist science compared to like what's the holistic outcome of those whole foods. And you brought up such good points about the industry funding that happens in science in America, at least specifically. Especially. It's funny how there's a little bit of a group in kind of this group we've been talking about, thinking that there's almost the opposite effect, that there's like an agenda to get people to eat vegan or plant-based, and it's going to make everybody sick, as if there's industry funding for like big broccoli or something. Right. There's no big broccoli, but there's definitely big ag, like big dairy.
No, I mean, I think when it comes to industry-funded studies, of course, that's often going to happen because they're trying to see like, is this beneficial or is it not? And so I don't think that you could paint it's not black and white again where you say, oh, it's industry funded, therefore it's garbage. Yeah. But I think when it is industry funded, it takes, you want to look at it with a little bit more scrutiny.
Yeah.
And, for some people, there is an agenda, just whatever the agenda is. But this idea that it's a gubernatorial conspiracy to make people weaker or something, it's just, totally funny. Ridiculous. Yeah.
So what about collagen? That's something else that's a really hot topic in the athletic nutrition world, or not even just athletic, but,
Yeah, in both, right? I think there's not 2 points of view, there's two reasons people are eating collagen, I think. One, we know that, like, a big motivation for people's diets is vanity, right? And so for skin and nails and hair and this type of thing, people are eating a lot of collagen. Hair, in fact, there's more like 95% keratin, I believe. But in terms of scalp health and the follicles, then collagen is impactful there. But then from an athletic perspective, when it comes to tendons, ligaments, cartilage, muscle, and even bone, collagen is a key protein. And so, it's important to be able to produce collagen. The step that doesn't make sense is just like you don't have to eat muscles to gain muscles, right? Or eat brains to get clever brains, right? That doesn't make any sense. You don't eat collagen to build more collagen, right? And so it sort of comes from some flawed studies in rats. Collagen is simply a protein, and protein is basically a chain, or like a necklace, if you can imagine, of amino acids, right? Imagine a necklace that's got lots of different colors, and each color is representative of an amino acid. What your body does when it consumes protein is it breaks the protein down into its constituent amino acids, right? And then your body just builds up the types of proteins that it needs, including collagen. And so actually the meta-analysis review on collagen, 17 out of the 19 studies were industry funded. On top of that, the product that was being supplied wasn't just collagen. It was collagen with antioxidants, with vitamins and minerals, right, and with lots of other things. So you could never really determine that it was the collagen itself. So the hypothesis came from feeding collagen to rats and seeing that the collagen, in some cases, was bypassing the breakdown process and making it into the bloodstream, right, not broken down. And so there was this hypothesis of, well, maybe that then makes it into the way where collagen is needed. So first of all, that's not the case in humans. Right? And then second of all, we don't even know if in rats it actually made it to where it meant to go. Furthermore, we know that protein itself, just protein in general, and getting more amino acids can be helpful for collagen and skin, right? And tendons and ligaments. And so it could just be that if you eat a bit of collagen, you're just getting more protein, but you could have just then eaten some beans or lentils.
Yeah, true.
And what we do know about collagen production is that it's protein, right? That it's getting more vitamin C. Where does that come from? Plants, right? Copper is important in collagen production, Okay, people on plant-based diets get more copper than people on omnivorous diets. And then there's zinc. And zinc is something, where plant-based eaters do get a little bit less of usually. And that's because a lot of plant-based eaters don't eat that healthfully, right? They eat a bunch of processed junk food. And so to get zinc, nuts and seeds, greens, and whole grains, right? And nutritional yeast also, those are going to be, high in zinc. So if you really want to, if you're worried about collagen production, protein, vitamin C, and copper, which you can get easily on plant-based diet, and then zinc, make sure you're getting greens, whole grains, nuts and seeds, and maybe some nutritional yeast.
Right. Yeah. No, that all makes sense because I've seen people do like a concoction where you like add collagen and then you add like a vitamin C source and then you add like a certain, instead of really just being like if you eat a wide variety of whole plant foods and abundant, and you're getting all of it.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the in the same with animal foods versus plant foods. I say all or something. I think it's also important to give people a bit of leeway within whole plant foods versus processed. And processed is a pretty grey word, right? Because if I take an apple and I cut it in half, I processed it. And then I cut it in lots of pieces, I processed it. And now I mash it up and I make it applesauce. Now it's processed. And then I bake it or I heat it up. Yeah. That's a process. So I sort of like to talk about refined more than or heavily, processed.
Yeah, the difference of explaining it is more clear.
There's a big difference, right? So I think with the all or something, it's again, get a large majority of your calories coming from whole plant foods. And then, if you sometimes eat things that aren't whole plant foods, I think that can be fine.
Yeah, making that distinction is pretty helpful because I think chopping up an apple and baking it into, some
that's a very different process, right, than removing part of rice.
Removing the fiber, or removing certain parts of rice or, refined grains and the ultra processed foods or ultra refined foods, if you will. Those are the foods that have all these different refined components and putting them together to create this ultra addictive concoction that's nowhere near in nature the way we're supposed to be eating.
Totally.
So that's a completely different thing than applesauce that's ground up apples.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, this is so fascinating. So I want to ask you then, what is next? Is there going to be a Game Changers 2.0? What can we expect?
Things. Like I mentioned, we've got the Game Changers Institute, which is an inclusive research, education, advocacy platform, an educational platform. And so we're doing a couple of things there. In fact, people might be interested in looking at a couple of the peer-reviewed papers that we put out. One is on the DS protein scoring system and its flaws as it relates to plant-based diets and as it relates to exercise performance. And you can look at that on through the website gamechangersinstitute.com.
Okay.
And then there's another paper on creatine, because that's another argument, is hey, well, meat's got creatine, there's not creatine in a plant-based diet. Well, first of all, your body makes creatine. Second of all, there is a benefit to having supplemental creatine. And we look at the difference between supplemental creatine versus creatine coming from meat, and it shows that the actual benefit is coming from supplements. So
why is that?
It's kind of a long paper.
Yeah, you're another time.
Yeah, it's a lot to go into, a little bit complex, but it's probably that the detriment, because again, food's a package, right?
Yeah.
So when creatine's in meat, great, and protein's in meat, great, but what about all the other things which could be offsetting it, right?
Yes, exactly.
And so again, that's, you've also got to weigh up athletic performance versus health, right? Jacking loads and loads of protein might be great for building as much muscle as possible, but it might actually not be great for long-term health, right? But what is clear is if you are going to have lots of protein, it's much healthier to get it from plants. So with those papers, we're putting out papers. We're also going to be putting out some sort of guidelines and educational pieces through the Game Changers Institute.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for sharing all that. Where can people find you so they can continue following your work and what you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, so we have on Instagram, Game Changers Movie, right? My personal Instagram is Lightning Wilks. Check out gamechangersmovie.com and gamechangersinstitute.com. And then the nutrition brand will be launching its own website and social media soon as well.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to end it here. Thanks for coming on the show.
No, thanks for having me. That was great.